Welcome, everyone. We'll get started pretty soon, but we'll probably just wait a couple more moments for folks to enter. I'm Lucy. We'll go over that in a bit as well, but I know our first lunch and learn without Kathleen, or maybe not quite the first. Yes, the first. Um, the first. So you have me. I'm our Climate and Clean Energy Director here at MCD, and I'm so excited to be with you today.
And we can probably get going. We're ready.
Awesome. Yeah. Hi, everyone. As I said, my name is Lucy Hochstartner, and I just want to welcome you and thank you so much for joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn Youth Fighting for Climate Justice Stories from the Frontlines. And thank you to everyone who's watching the recording. We are thrilled to be joined by Phil Gregory, who is of counsel with Our Children's Trust, Rylee Brooke, a plaintiff from Navahine, the Hawaii Department of Transportation, and hopefully joining in just a minute, Miko Vergun, who's a plaintiff from Juliana, the United States. And my name, as I said earlier, is Lucy Hochstartner. I am the Climate and Clean Energy Director at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just and thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate. And MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. And this Lunch and Learn series has been going since 2020 and has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. And just wanted to start with a few notes before we dive into today's program. We'll hear from our speakers first and tackle your questions in the Q&A at the end. You don't have to wait on those questions, though. Please send your questions to me or Maggie through the chat as they occur to you. We'll synthesize and ask as many of them as possible following the presentation. And we ask that you not message the speakers directly so that they can keep focusing on their presentation. And if you have any kind of technical difficulties at all, please just message Maggie through the chat and she'll help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon. You can also find all of the recordings of all of our programs on YouTube, where a number of playlists can help you focus on particular topics. Thank you so much to everyone who's here. And Phil, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Lucy. Hang on, let me get here we go. So first off, I'm Phil Gregory. As Lucy said, I work with an organization called Our Children's Trust, and we bring cases on behalf of youth throughout the United States. And essentially, our cases are human rights based. And what I mean by that is that our Children's Trust brings cases where they let the youth voice be heard. Here's Kelsey, Juliana, and the other plaintiffs in front of the United States Supreme Court. Our Children's Trust was founded in 2010. And why are we bringing cases on behalf of youth? Well, here's a brief foray into science. We won't spend much time in science, but I wanted to show you where we are in terms of three measures: parts per million of CO2. And if you see here at the top, it shows that in terms of CO2, our Earth, as long as humans have lived on the Earth, has never had this much CO2 in the atmosphere. You see the number is almost atmospheric, and how CO2 in the atmosphere is tracked by global temperature change. You can see temperature changes now beyond what it's been for hundreds of thousands of years, and sea level rise is getting up there as well. As when we began bringing these cases, we began tracking how is the United States doing in terms of a producer of crude oil. And right now, the United States is the top producer of crude oil and the top producer of liquefied natural gas. And atmospheric CO2 has risen 14 parts per million since 2018 alone. And as Dr. Steve Running, one of our climate expert witnesses, testified, the globe is blowing past every prior record temperature every few years. And that is a serious problem, particularly for youth. As one of our individuals who we work with on pediatric medicine has said, the climate crisis is the single biggest driver of health for every child born today. So at our Children's Trust, our goal is to provide science-powered solutions in the court through youth-powered litigation. And that way, we allow our youth to have a democracy-powered future. And the three things you see depicted here, one is the measurement of atmospheric CO2 at the Mauna Loa Observatory. It's called the Keeling curve. And you can see that we should be at 350 parts per million. That's the measure that is safe, or 350 or below. We're beyond 422 parts per million now. In 2024, our Children's Trust represented 181 children across 15 states and 4 countries who are advocating in courts and judicial bodies. And we had significant wins in 2024, which I'm going to discuss with you. We don't charge the youth plaintiffs for the cases, and our experts provide their testimony at no cost to the youth plaintiffs or their families. And I think it's important to also note that the youth in these cases, they're not seeking any form of monetary recovery. They just want to make sure that the government policy complies with the best available science and their constitutional rights. Our cases in the US are listed here, starting at the top, Held versus State of Montana. And you'll see our Children's Trust logo in 4 states where we're in the process of bringing cases: Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Texas, as well as other states that we're seriously considering as venues for cases. So let's get into the cases. If you were at the Evening for the Environment, you heard me talk about Held versus State of Montana, the first ever constitutional climate trial. That's Ricky Held whose face is in the slide. We won at the trial court in August 2023. And then in December of last year, the Montana Supreme Court affirmed the trial court decision, stating that there was a constitutional right to a safe and livable climate. And that's a historic ruling, the first of its kind from any state Supreme Court. And in essence, what the Montana Supreme Court decided was that the state's acts in promoting fossil fuel extraction and the failure to consider climate change impacts in making permitting and other decisions violated the youth plaintiffs' fundamental constitutional rights to a clean and healthful environment, dignity, and safety. And to go back very briefly to Judge Seeley's August 2023 decision. She heard extensive testimony at trial from the youth plaintiffs, and they shared their very emotional personal stories about how climate change was already affecting their health, their income, and their heritage through heat, smoke-filled skies, major floods, the disruption of native cultural practices, etc. As Judge Seeley noted, the youth plaintiffs are disproportionately harmed by fossil fuel pollution and climate impacts. And I think that's an extremely important point, that it's youth who are going to be and are now disproportionately harmed by fossil fuel pollution. The Supreme Court decision compels the state to carefully assess greenhouse gas emissions and climate impacts in all fossil fuel permitting decisions. So the agencies now have to evaluate the potential harm from any new fossil fuel projects and determine whether the project can be justified in light of the ongoing unconstitutional degradation of Montana's environment, natural resources, and climate. And so the Held decision is extremely important, as it is the most significant court decision giving youth hope that governments will be forced to change through litigation. Now I'd like to turn to our case in Hawaii, Navahine versus the Hawaii Department of Transportation. I want to point out here that we have attorneys and plaintiffs in the picture here, but this case we filed against the Hawaii Department of Transportation because the Hawaii Department of Transportation accounted for over 60% of emissions in the state of Hawaii. And so we targeted the department last June of 2024. We had a trial. Leading up to the trial, we had the youth having their depositions taken by Department of Justice attorneys and attorneys from a major private law firm, Morgan, Lewis, and Bacchius, and they deposed all the youth plaintiffs. We had our experts do their reports. They were also deposed. And right on the eve of trial, we were able to reach a historic settlement with the governor and the Department of Transportation. And that settlement was particularly driven by our expert witnesses, because our experts showed the Hawaii Department of Transportation and the governor's office how Hawaii could shift to be having all their energy needs met by solar, wind, and water. And that way, it would not destroy the biodiversity, indigenous culture, or youth health in Hawaii that fossil fuel emissions were doing. So these are experts, along with a couple of plaintiffs and attorneys, who, again, donated their time to help the plaintiffs in the Hawaii case. And the settlement with the Department of Transportation had extremely important provisions. First off, the state declared that the right to a climate that sustains life is crucial for Hawaii. And the Department of Transportation agreed to take all actions necessary to achieve zero emissions no later than 2045 for ground, sea, and inter-island air transportation. And these actions include establishing a greenhouse gas reduction plan within a year, which they are working hard to achieve, reforming the Department of Transportation through budgeting and programming, creating governmental positions to oversee the implementation of the settlement and to create benchmarks and providing youth with a seat at the table. And we'll talk about that table in just a second. That table is the Youth Advisory Council. The Youth Advisory Council, for purposes of the settlement, is where the Hawaii Department of Transportation reports to youth in Hawaii, including the Navahine plaintiffs. The youth shape policies, and they'll be advising the Department of Transportation for the next 20 years. And what makes this settlement special? Well, it's unparalleled in terms of a climate settlement in its nature, scope, and length, in terms of an implementation plan to achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions. It provides for ongoing court supervision until 2045. It also provides a leadership model for states and countries around the world. Hawaii was able to get this settlement done because all three branches, the legislature, the courts, and the governor's office, were able to work together. And so it shows true democracy in action for the first time on climate change. We have with us Rylee. And Rylee, I'm going to ask you some questions now. I want you to step forward.
Hi, everyone.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you became a plaintiff in the case?
I originally heard of it from a friend of a friend. Oh, my name is Rylee. I'm 17 now. I joined the case when I was like 12 or 13. It was a long time ago when I first got involved with the case. I live on the island of Oahu. I'm like right in the center of the Hawaiian Islands and in the center of the island. I'm from Mililani, if you guys know where that is. But I first got involved with the case. I heard of it through a friend of a friend who heard about it from another plaintiff named Messina. And the reason that we connected with it, or I connected with Messina through it, was because I grew up in Hawaii doing a bunch of advocacy stuff. So my parents called like the state capitol and our city and county offices like my second home, because from the ages 8 through right before COVID, I like lived there. I was always there testifying, or like in offices of senators or representatives, which is crazy to think about now. But I was involved with a bunch of different bills and resolutions having to do with climate or animal advocacy. So I was really well connected in that world. So I heard of the case from a friend of a friend. And at the time, we didn't know who we were suing. It was just like this huge, great organization came down here and they're going to sue the government somehow. We don't know what part of government. We don't know what other kids are involved. And at the time, it was like a doc or a form that you just had to fill out and email to them. And we didn't hear back for a bit. And then the attorneys, well, now my attorneys started contacting me. They're like, can we set up a Zoom meeting? And at first I was like, this is a little weird. They're just hopping on Zoom with me, like grown attorneys, and asking me questions about everything in my life, which now I know was because they were talking about my story and they were writing it all down and putting something really solid for the case together. But obviously 12-year-old me was very confused. It was a lot of sitting and waiting. And then we had to go to in-person trials and I got to meet everyone in person. And that was really nerve-wracking. But for the most part, that's how I became a plaintiff. I kind of like stumbled into it.
And you briefly touched on it, but other than your work as a plaintiff, can you tell us a little bit about what you've done for climate advocacy, not only in connection with the lawsuit, but in other aspects of your life?
So at the age of 8, I founded a nonprofit called the Catalyst Club with a mission to create and provide opportunities for children and youth to be a catalyst for change that creates a positive impact in the world. So the nonprofit itself is a huge umbrella organization to 8 freestanding organizations under it. and it's completely youth run by local kids in Hawaii. So one of our youth directors just turned 13. She runs like a Christmas program. They don't all do climate things. They really do all different things that follow under the same mission. But one of our programs called Promise to Our Keiki, we named after the first bill that I wrote and turned into the Capitol. Um, and what it does is helps youth get involved through civics workshops, figure out how to write testimony, submit at the state capitol, or call their attorneys, get comfortable with public speaking, writing and putting in your own bills or resolutions. And then the second part of it is documentation. So writing and publishing books and connecting them with local filmmakers to create these documentaries so we can document things like this. I know they watched the Juliana movie last night, or they saw a preview of it, right? So something kind of like that, but completely youth run. Um, I said that I grew up testifying for different things. I was a part of the plastic phase out bill. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but I was a part of that when I was like 9 through, it took so long, but I got involved with that when I was like 9 or 10. And then I got to connect with a bunch of great kids who were also a part of that, who got to help us with our case also. So that's kind of how I grew up. My childhood was really weird in that sense, but that's basically like my climate advocacy.
Thanks. And I earlier referenced that your deposition or your testimony was taken where you were grilled by an attorney. Can you briefly explain to everybody what that experience was like? Some big time attorney asking you questions under oath.
Sure. It was really nerve-wracking, obviously. Phil was my deposition coach. Because it was so nerve-wracking, and I'm super competitive, I had to look at it like a game. And so every time I would not say something right, but answer correctly with the right legal words, I would think about like, I'm getting an A on this. I'm doing great. And then I got in trouble for the like weirdest things. I got in trouble for making eye contact with Phil once. Like they were just really, really strict. And then it was a little, I don't know if it made it better or worse, but the first plaintiff from our case that went in, she's the oldest plaintiff out of all of us. We ranged from when it was filed, the age of like 11 to 18. Our oldest plaintiff went in, and she was older than 18 at this point, and they made her cry. Yeah. And so it was terrifying. Our lawyers like blasted them for that. So I feel like they were a little better with me, but they pulled out a fat stack of papers of literally everything. If you search my name up on Firefox, Safari, like everything, they pulled up screenshots of all of it, and they made me go through this huge stack of paper, asking if I recall all of it. So it was a lot of reading. I'm grateful that I did not have the longest deposition. The longest one was, I think, like 6 hours straight, and it was for one of our experts. Yeah, but the deposition wasn't too bad. I had an okay experience, but I would not want to do it again. But I would if I needed to. Yeah.
I remember that deposition very well. And finally, why don't you briefly comment on your reaction to the settlement that was achieved last summer?
The settlement honestly was not, or we weren't expecting a settlement because our state had put aside like $3 to $4 million just to fight us because they were flying out of state attorneys in, and they were hiring the best of the best, most expensive people. So they put a bunch of money aside. And so we were like, okay, we're in this fight for a long run. And then we started going to mediation with them. And it was just a really long time. It was a lot of like sitting and waiting to hear back. And then when they first put an offer in to settle, we were kind of confused. They sat all of the plaintiffs down, and they're like, okay, we're thinking about settling. It's your guys' call. Like, you guys get the last say because it is your case. And so we were like, settling? What do you mean settling? We were confused by the term settling because it sounds like we're like going down and decreasing our value when it comes to our case. But then our attorneys did a great job explaining all of it. There was again, legal things have giant stacks of papers. And so they sent us a like 200-page email and they went through all of it with us. But the settlement honestly is like everything we could have asked for and more, like with the cherry on top. I'm a part of the Youth Advisory Council that he mentioned. What can I say about the council? It's like 2-year terms. There's 20 youth on it, and 5 of them are plaintiffs, including me. We just had our first meeting, and then we're going to help kind of guide the Department of Transportation through the greenhouse gas emission reduction plan and all of that. But I think that settling is the best thing that we could have done because okay, so we went into like mini trial, which felt like a real trial, but it definitely was not. It was just because the out-of-state attorneys were trying to turn over our case and get it like killed, which they do not do. But we had to sit in those really uncomfortable court seats. And I just, none of us were looking forward to this trial. So the fact that it was canceled and we got to settle, automatically all of us were like, yay, perfect. And then we're like, what do you mean settle? What do you mean that's what we're doing? But the people from the DOT are great. They're really good at working with kids. They have good like adult facilitators with us at the meetings and with the plaintiffs in general. And they're really good at keeping us updated and making sure we're super involved. So my thoughts on settling is now I'm great with it.
Well, thank you. And we'll have more questions for you later on, but we're going to move on to some other cases here.
Thank you so much.
So I earlier showed you other cases that our Children's Trust is bringing throughout the United States. Here are the plaintiffs in our Utah case, which is currently before the Utah Supreme Court. We have another case in Alaska, Sagunik, which was recently filed and is before what's essentially the lowest court or the superior court for the state of Alaska. That's Andrew Welly of our Children's Trust arguing in court with the plaintiffs behind him. We have another case in Virginia, Layla versus the Commonwealth in Virginia. That case is in the Court of Appeals of Virginia. Here are the plaintiffs in our case, Genesis versus the United States Environmental Protection Agency. That's filed in federal court in Los Angeles. And these plaintiffs, several of them live in the LA area, and they were seriously affected by the fires. And I think to understand what this means is you need to step away for a moment from preconceived notion that children are little adults and work with the premise that children are distinct from adults, that they're in early phases of human development and physiologically and psychologically much more vulnerable. Their developing lungs, brains, and immune systems are particularly sensitive to climate harms. And they're dependent on caregivers, such as their community, and are politically and economically powerless. And I want to just emphasize that last point. Youth are politically and economically powerless, and the only way they have a voice in government is through the courts. And they've faced a long history of discrimination. We know of the fires in Los Angeles. Just here's some United States acres burned annually, and you see over the past decade, 20 years or so, they've really had excessive amounts of acreage burned, particularly in the West. Essentially, the Genesis case goes after the Environmental Protection Agency's discounting policies and practices because these policies and practices value youth and future generations less than they do adults. And our assertion is that this violates the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution because it discriminates against youth. Now we'll turn to the Juliana case. These are the 21 plaintiffs in the Juliana case in 2019 in Central Park in New York. And Miko is going to be talking in a few minutes, is right front and center with the Salem sweatshirt on. The Juliana case, when we brought it, was based on the NAACP cases, particularly Brown versus Board of Education. And the concept there was that all youth are entitled to equal protection under the laws and cannot be subject to any form of harm by the government. And the Brown case, the evidence in that case was that youth of color were being treated differently and were, as a result, physically and psychologically being harmed by the school districts. When we filed Juliana back in August of 2015, our case went before the federal district court judge in Eugene, Oregon, Ann Aiken, who in November 2016, in denying the federal government's motion to dismiss, wrote that she had no doubt that the right to a climate system capable of sustaining human life is fundamental to a free and ordered society. That decision went up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and that's a 3-judge panel. If you're looking at the slide, the top 2 judges wrote a majority opinion that I'm going to talk about in just a second. The judge below, Judge Staten, dissented, and the issue that divided these judges was whether or not the federal courts could do anything about the climate crisis. So I'm going to say that again. So there's 3 branches of government, as we all know: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And the issue that they were wrestling with was whether or not the judiciary or the federal courts could do anything about the climate crisis. The judges at the top said, you know what, the youth are being harmed. The harm is being caused by the federal government, but we, the federal judiciary, can't do anything about it. Instead, the children's case has to be presented to the political branches of government or through the ballot box. Now, remember, these youth, when they filed this case, didn't have the ability to vote. So they couldn't do what the majority opinion said. And the dissent called them out on this. The dissent said fundamental rights may not be submitted to vote. They depend on the outcome of no elections. They're beyond the reach of majorities and officials, and that's why the court system exists. We went back down in Juliana to the district court, who granted our motion to amend our complaint or to keep the case going forward, because, in part, as Judge Aiken wrote, when government conduct catastrophically harms American citizens, the judiciary is constitutionally required to perform its independent role. So that decision was then brought back up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals by the Biden administration, where the Department of Justice filed what's called a mandamus petition. And out of over 40,000 cases in which the Department of Justice is defending the United States in civil litigation, Juliana is the only time the Department of Justice has used this really extraordinary remedy, mandamus, to stop a case from moving forward. So out of over 40,000 cases, The Juliana case is the sole case where the Department of Justice tried to stop the case from going to trial by applying mandamus. And mandamus was granted by a three-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit in May of last year. All three judges were appointed by President Trump during his first term, where they said there's no ability, we had no ability to amend our complaint, and that declaratory relief provided no redress. So we filed our petition with the United States Supreme Court, and that petition is currently pending before the court. In mid-February, the government's brief is due before the Supreme Court. We will then brief it by early March, and then the Supreme Court will consider whether or not to overturn the Ninth Circuit decision in Juliana. And Miko, I know you're anxious to talk about your experience here. If you could get on and tell everyone here a little bit about your background before we start talking about Juliana.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for coming. So I guess I'll start from the very, very beginning. I was born and adopted from the Marshall Islands, which is a frontline community. I'm very used to explaining where the Marshall Islands is and what they are because not that many people know about it. But the Marshall Islands is essentially a group of small islands in the middle of the Pacific. I like to say that it's like you think of Australia and then you think of Japan, it's right smack in the middle. And wow, this was a statement made, a long time ago, probably in the 2010s, and I can only say it's increased its danger from now, to now, but it's one of the first to, I want to say one of the first to be in danger of going underwater because we're not doing that, or nothing is happening because of climate change to do anything to prevent it or stop it. So that kind of got me, that's how I got into activism, was being really concerned that I wasn't going to have a place to go. If I have kids, show them in the future. And I think that anyone from the islands or anyone who is Indigenous can speak to this, that land is really connected to the culture. So, and I can get into that a little bit more, but having that taken away or being in danger of being taken away is a huge focal point for my activism, I would say. Definitely one of my calls to action. My second call to action, a little more personal. My brother has asthma. And I think Phil will speak to harms in a few minutes, but I would say those essentially are my two harms, or one of my many. My brother has asthma, so because of the air quality decreasing, especially during wildfire season. If you've been, you've heard about it in California, it's just as bad in Oregon and it's getting worse. Every summer it's coming with more frequency, more intensity. And so my brother's asthma gets worse. And not only do I see his asthma get worse, I also see the home that I live in, which is Beaverton, Oregon, get really affected by these wildfires. The community, the nature, pretty much everything that I call home. So it essentially two of my homes that I hold near and dear are impacted by climate change. And I wanted to do something about it. But unfortunately at the time I was only a kid. My mom, I would say, is the reason why me and my brother kind of got into climate change activism in the first place. So when we were really young, at the time, she was stay-at-home mom, and my dad, he would work. So when she would have the time, she would bring us to environmental club meetings. She did Sierra Club. She did REI. They had meetings as well. And then at some point, it started getting into actual climate activism, and 350 opens chapter in PDX, or in Portland, and we started going to those as well. So it was pretty natural for us to be in that environment at that point when we ended up hearing about Juliana.
And
And
Miko,
oh yeah, go ahead.
how did you become a plaintiff in Juliana?
Yeah, so around that time, um, as I was getting into activism, I'm glad you brought this up because at the end of middle school, which is sort of when I started hearing about all these like youth-led activism actions. At the end of middle school, I decided to write a paper about the Marshall Islands and I found out about the history of between the Marshall Islands and America. Um, for those that don't know, America decided to test the first hydrogen bomb in the Marshall Islands, which was 1,000 times more stronger than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs put together, which is not to compare, but to give you a picture of how catastrophic and devastating that was. And the United States basically lied and said about how much they wanted to compensate. So they swooped everything onto an island called Marina Island and put a cement dome over it called Marina Dome. And because of increased climate disasters, wear and tear, it's threatening to leak about 1,000 yards of nuclear debris into the Pacific Ocean, one of the largest bodies of oceans, and the most nations share that ocean. And so I was like, I need to get more involved in climate change. This is something that's really important. Our climate change activism, this is really important. And so I actually heard about Juliana through the grapevine. So this is when I was, fresh off of that. And I was like, I need to do something. And so those 350 meetings that I was talking about that my mom would join, the sentiment was sweet, but my brother and I, we would talk about this all the time. We would constantly hear, we're doing this for our kids, we're doing this for our grandkids, for their futures. And we would constantly be one of the only kids in the room. This was at a time where youth activism wasn't encouraged. And you know what? Those kids that did not go to those meetings at the time, they were off being kids, but a lot of people like, Rylee and other youth in the Youth Week of community and other plaintiffs, we were not afforded that luxury because climate change is an imminent threat, and we understood that at a young age. And so at that point, there was no such thing as being a kid. And it was really frustrating because we would constantly hear that rhetoric, and it would be like, well, we're kids and we want to do something about it. So it felt like no involvement and no encouragement for involvement. Like kids should be kids. And that's actually when my brother and I met. Sorry, I keep saying my brother. My brother's also a plaintiff, if no one got that. um, um, that's where we met Aji, who is a fellow plaintiff, through an organization that leads youth-led workshops about climate change. And it's kids teaching kids about climate change and how to talk about it. And I heard him sing with his brother. He's a big singer, great artist. And I heard him sing about exploding trains that were carrying oil. And I was like, this is so inspiring. And turns out he was actually part of a similar lawsuit called Foster versus Washington Department of Ecology. And when we heard about that, my brother and I were so bummed that we did not get to join. We kind of heard about it really late, but we were like, that's so cool. And I also, I somehow found Our Children's Trust before they came with Juliana. Christy Cooper, who is the filmmaker of the Youth Week of documentary, made a mini series called Trust, and I somehow came across it on YouTube, and I saw Jamie's video, and I was like, this is so moving. And Jamie happens to also be a plaintiff in the lawsuit. So to condense it all, I was just very inspired. by other youth, because I didn't really see that. I didn't grow up seeing that. And Fridays for Future didn't actually start happening until 2019 when I was a senior. So, or a senior in high school. So um, I joined because of that. And I joined because I was tired of feeling helpless and feeling that my future was put on the line and there was nothing I can do about it because I couldn't vote.
And Miko, Rylee spoke about having her deposition taken. Why don't you briefly comment on what that experience was like for you?
Oh my gosh. Even though it was like, I want to say also like it was before the 2020s. So like I don't remember much about it, but I do remember feeling really nervous. And I do remember that it was very tense. And like Rylee said, it was very strict. I was also like, I was like, if I mess up, like I felt a lot of pressure. Um, but and yeah, like I feel like they were asking a lot of, if you watch the documentary, you will see that they ask a lot of unnecessary questions, questions that have really nothing to do with the case, but it is like they are trying to the questions that I felt that we were getting was kind of like the public opinion that we got at the very beginning of filing the lawsuit, which is like, do these kids even know what they're talking about? Which I find very insulting. But yeah, like it was definitely very weird. I've never done a deposition before. Um, and it was it was very interesting. I remember that they would constantly argue with our lawyers about what counts as plaintiff client privilege. That was constantly like um like a big pause moment in each deposition, I would say, because they would be like, you can't say that. And then the government lawyers would be like, we're just asking a question. They can't answer the question. And yeah, it was very tense, I would say. One of the most stressful moments in my life.
Well, thanks, Miko. We'll have some more questions later on, and I'm going to just finish up talking about a couple more cases. But you alluded to the movie Youth versus Gov, and that's about the Juliana case, and it's available on Netflix for those of you who are interested. Youth versus Gov. Um, we've got a couple more cases and matters to talk about. Here are the plaintiffs in our Canadian case, LaRose versus His Majesty the King. And that case is going to trial in Vancouver, British Columbia in October 2026, where there the plaintiffs are calling for an order to require the government to implement a comprehensive climate recovery plan. Our youth also have been involved in testifying in various international proceedings. Here's one of the Hawaii plaintiffs testifying before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, along with Kelly Matheson from Our Children's Trust. And so in closing, I think it's really important, as you see from Rylee and Miko's answers to the questions, that the youth have the ability to use their voice. That's how they get hope. And Our Children's Trust tries to do that. If you want to know more about our cases, please go to the Our Children's Trust website and sign up for the online mailing list. And I wanted to thank you all for attending. And I'll stop the share and turn it all over for questions. Lucy.
Well, thank you so much. This was just fabulous. And, Phil is an incredible lawyer doing incredible things, all pro bono. And I know really comes from his desire to have a better world for his grandkids. And Rylee and Miko, you are both so incredible. And I, as a young person, am so grateful for the work that you're doing, because I am not in a court case. Miko, when I heard about yours, I was like, sort of around, I was probably like 18, I guess, and was like, had that same feeling that it sounds like you had about that other case in Washington where I was like, oh, why didn't I get to be part of something like that? That's so cool. And so we're just really so grateful. And we've got a bunch of questions from the audience. We'll probably only have time for a few. But I'm curious what you learned about to, both Miko and Rylee, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about the legal process in this? And I was also interested, like you both have experiences with activism in other parts of the system as well. And so like I think particularly in this moment, how are you feeling about making change in all those different systems? And I think obviously Miko has had a very different experience with the judicial system than say you did, Rylee. So would love if you guys could speak to those different venues and your experiences there.
I can go first. Sorry, she's not on my little screen, but um something that surprised me, this is going to sound really odd, but the amount of papers that they use, I keep talking about all their stacks of paper. Our lawyers did a really good job at keeping a lot of it digital and like leaving as little bit of like a physical paper trail as they could. But when they were talking about how over this case we've submitted over 50,000 pages of things, that threw me for a loop because I remember in like high school, I'd be like, we have to write a 10-page essay, and they're over here writing 50,000 pages for us. And all pro bono. And then my experience, so in Hawaii, now at least I'm seeing a lot more leaders being more open-minded to letting youth in and having their voices be heard. When I started talking in the legislature when I was younger, like before I was double digits, I had a lot of senators that they were coming up to me and they were like, "Can you be an intern for me?" And they just wanted me to like talk on their behalf or testify for their bills to like push their bills. And I was like, I talk for bills that I want to talk for. Not I'm not gonna be your intern. My mom was like, "What do you need a 9-year-old interning for you for?" Um but now there's a lot more people genuinely like leaders genuinely interested in what you have to say and bringing youth voices to the table, and then I'm hoping that since our lawsuit is something that could be like copy and pasted to other states, that happens more too because we have a great relationship with the Department of Transportation now. The director's name is Ed Sniffen, and he's really good with us. um but yeah, that's my hopes and my perspective.
Wow. A few, I guess, like not as hopeful. I like a few things that I learned about the lawsuit that I'm in is that there are so many loopholes in the justice system. I feel like we put our faith in well, just like we put our faith in people that we elect into office. um I feel like they took advantage of the justice system, and like especially when we all like when the Republicans have taken it over, is because we've been through wait, one, two, three administrations. Well, two technically, but three. um and it's extremely disappointing how each administration has not wanted to sit down with us and settle on our case, or at least take us to trial, because I think I mean, just like Rylee said, I think they do take us seriously, because otherwise they wouldn't be playing this game with us. um they would, like, if they did not take us seriously, then I feel like they would have let us go on to trial and let it play out, but they know they're not going to win because we have too much evidence stacked up against them. um this is kind of related and leads into the next thing that I learned, which is that if you see the documentary, and I don't want to give too much away, there is this huge, big timeline that all the lawyers put together, and I was shocked. Well, before they put it in the documentary, I mean, we were able to see the timeline ourselves, and I was shocked to see how far back it goes, the climate denial. I was shocked to see that there were that some presidents tried to do something and some presidents dismantled it. I was shocked that there were acts to prevent people from talking about it, um, about climate change. And uh, um, James Hansen, who is one of um, the leading experts in our case, he sounded the alarm bells. And I forgot how far back it goes. I feel so bad, but it goes far back enough that we could have done something from now. And it's so frustrating. I feel like Phil talked a little bit about when our lawsuit was filed. I'll give you a bigger picture of how long I've been involved in the lawsuit, which is that I was 14 when we filed the lawsuit. I'm about to turn 24. That's 10 years. And it's extremely, oh my gosh, it's extremely frustrating. And I'm so thankful for lawsuits that we were able to get lawsuits started in the state level, because they've been getting a lot more luck. Especially uh wow, especially why is it not coming to my head? Montana had a big win, and that gave me a lot of hope, that a lot of these state wins. And that's, I think honestly that if not the branches of government um giving us giving us a branch to help us out a little bit, um we really need public support, because I think that's the only reason why we've been able to, I mean, other than the work that our wonderful attorneys have done, and the us speaking out and everything, I think public support is really what has been able to keep us um above it all. Um and yeah, sorry, I went off on a rant, but
No,
that
that's
is what I've
great.
learned so far.
No, I appreciate that, Miko, and it I just can't even imagine how frustrating it must be. And those state cases have given me a lot of hope as well. And I'm still holding out hope for you guys. And for anyone who hasn't seen You Speak Of, it's incredible. It's on Netflix. We'll send it around. And my last question for all of you, and I think just like a one sentence answer from each of you. Everyone's wondering what you guys are doing next, and some folks had specific questions about that. But I can't even imagine like how many times, Rylee, you must have been asked what you are going to major in college. So we're just going to leave it vague. What is next for you? Are you going to college, going to school, working, taking some time off? And Phil, are there any other cases in the works, or any in Maine? And just like a quick answer from each of you, maybe Rylee, then Miko, then Phil.
My whole life I haven't been into going to college. I was like, I already know exactly what I want to do and I'm doing it. Recently I've been looking into going into like PR and marketing because it helps me in every aspect of my life, regardless of what I do. And then through a lot of speaking events, I've gotten college offers. So I think that kind of changed my perspective too. But I'm looking at a few Ivies.
I'm currently finishing my undergraduate. I'm graduating with a major in cultural anthropology and a minor in digital communication arts. I was literally thinking about PR, but I decided to go into the route of museum studies. Um, I've been seeing a lot of exhibits and really inspired, so I wanted to get into museum studies and digital archiving, and still doing climate policy.
I'm helping our Children's Trust put together new cases to help move forward their existing cases. And I'm really anxious to talk to individuals and groups in Maine to see what, if anything, needs to be done in Maine to help the government address the climate situation.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. This was just so fabulous. You all are so inspiring. And also, like, we've all got to do the work. I know that I sometimes find it really frustrating when people are just like, you're so inspiring. It's like we've all got to get down to business. I know these past couple weeks have been really, really rough. But for me personally, I've been more frustrated by seeing like the lack of action on our side than necessarily like things coming down on the other side. I think we need a plan, and it's really exciting to see the way that our Children's Trust has a really concrete plan for using the judicial system to protect our future. So just thank you so much to everyone. We'll be sending an email around this afternoon, and we'll see you all next week when we're joined by storyteller Antonio Rocha, who, along with Dr. McMahon, historian of global slavery at the Smithsonian African American History Museum, will tell us about the story of the slave ship Malaga.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.